They told us the ancient world was isolated, that continents were cut off by endless oceans, that before recorded history, people barely knew their own shores. But what if that story is wrong? What if, long before official maps, long before famous explorers, there already existed a vast trade network connecting distant lands across oceans, deserts, and forgotten sea routes? Imagine waking up in an ancient port city and seeing goods you've never seen before, stones from mountains you've never heard of, spices from forests on the other side of the world, metals not found anywhere near your homeland. No written records explain how these items arrived. No official history names the traders who carried them. Yet the evidence exists, buried in ruins, scattered across continents, hidden in plain sight. Long before the age of empire and documented navies, coastal settlements thrived on exchange. Shells from faraway seas appear in inland graves. Metals from unknown sources turn up in tools and jewelry. Strange artifacts show up thousands of miles from where their raw materials naturally exist. These are not accidents. They are fingerprints of movement, of routes traveled again and again, of knowledge passed between people who should never have met according to the timelines we're taught. Somewhere in the deep past, humans mastered long-distance connection without leaving behind the paperwork modern historians rely on. The sea was not a barrier to them. It was a road. Ancient sailors learned the rhythm of winds, the breathing of currents, the language of stars. They didn't need compasses carved in brass. They memorized the sky. They read the color of water, the behavior of birds, the shape of clouds at dawn. Entire routes were preserved in memory and ritual, taught from elder to apprentice, never written down, never meant to survive outside living minds. When those lines of knowledge broke, the routes vanished with them. Across distant shores, similar weights, similar ship designs, similar symbols appear. Echoes of a shared system. Ports rose where currents meet. Markets flourish where rivers kiss the sea. Goods move quietly between worlds. Copper from one land traded for obsidian from another. Rare stones exchanged for spices. Woven cloth for salt. Stories for tools. Each exchange tightened invisible threads across continents, forming a web of movement so old that by the time writing arrived, its origin was already forgotten. Then something changed. Climate shifted, seas rose, harbors drowned, storm patterns moved, earthquakes fractured coastlines. Entire port cities slid beneath waves. With them went the living memory of routes that once bound the world together. Survivors retreated inland, knowledge fractured into fragments. What was once a continuous network became isolated paths. Later civilizations inherited the goods, but not the maps. They found artifacts without knowing the roads that carried them there. And so, history began with amnesia. Centuries later, explorers would be praised for discovering lands that had already been touched by ancient traders whose names were erased by time. Archaeologists would uncover objects in places they should never exist and call them anomalies. Scholars would debate coincidence, contamination, coincidence again. But the pattern remains. Distant continents, showing signs of contact, long before official contact was supposed to exist. The world was connected before we remember being connected. And if this network once existed, it raises an uncomfortable question. How much of human history is not a story of progress from isolation to connection, but a story of forgetting something we once knew? If ancient people could cross oceans, track seasons, and maintain trade routes without written records, what else have we lost? What other systems once linked the world quietly, efficiently, and were then erased by catastrophe, collapse, and time? This isn't just about trade. It's about memory. It's about how civilizations rise, connect, and then fall into silence, leaving behind objects that don't fit the story we prefer to tell. The lost trade network didn't disappear because it failed. It disappeared because the world that sustained it broke apart. The oceans swallowed ports. The winds changed their paths. The teachers died without students. And the roads across the world closed, not with walls, but with forgetting. As generations passed, the memory of the old routes thinned like smoke in the wind. What remained were fragments, stories told to children that slowly turned into myths, symbols carved into stone that no longer matched living practices, and objects passed down as heirlooms with no one remembering where they truly came from. In some villages, elders spoke of the road over water, a phrase that sounded poetic but once described a real passage followed by countless vessels guided only by stars and seasonal winds. The sea itself became a keeper of secrets, swallowing harbors, reshaping coastlines, and hiding the evidence of what once was ordinary travel across distant continents. People began to build in similar ways without ever meeting again. Boat shapes echoed each other in places separated by oceans. Weights used in trade matched in proportion, though their names and languages differed. Knots tied by sailors followed the same logic, passed down as practical knowledge rather than written instruction. This is how systems survive when records do not. Through hands, not pages, knowledge lived in muscles and routines, in the rhythm of daily work. When disaster broke those routines, knowledge vanished faster than any library could burn. The collapse of the network did not happen in one moment. It fractured slowly. A stormier ocean here, a drying river there, a harbor choked with silt, a coastal earthquake that turned a thriving port into a memory beneath waves. Each break forced traders to shorten their journeys. Routes that once spanned continents became regional. Regional paths shrank into local exchanges. Over time, people forgot that their ancestors had ever crossed open seas at all. The world seemed larger, not smaller, after the network died. What followed was a strange reversal of progress. Later civilizations, thinking themselves pioneers, struggled to relearn what had once been routine. Ships hugged coastlines instead of crossing deep waters. Navigators feared the open ocean. Maps became cautious. The idea of vast maritime trade felt impossible, even though the goods and their markets told a different story. Exotic materials kept appearing, but their origins turned into legends. Some were said to come from lands of monsters, others from the edges of the world. The truth was more unsettling. They came from routes that no longer existed. In ruins near forgotten shorelines, foundations of warehouses still lie half buried in sand, aligned to tides and currents that no longer flow the same way. Inland, tools made from metals that exist nowhere nearby raise quiet questions. Jewelry crafted from stones found only on distant continents sits in ancient graves, carried there by hands that history refuses to name. These are not symbols of coincidence. They are receipts from a system that once moved goods, people, and ideas across the world without leaving behind a ledger. When writing finally spread, it arrived too late to capture the height of the network. Scribes recorded kings, wars, and borders, but the old routes were already fading. Traders had become villagers. Sailors had become fishermen who never left sight of land. The stories of long voyages sounded like fantasy to those who had never seen a ship disappear beyond the horizon. Memory collapsed into myth. The greatest trade system of the ancient world slipped between the cracks of recorded history. Not because it was small, but because it belonged to a time when humans didn't preserve knowledge the way we do now. And yet, the echoes remain, in the strange distribution of materials, in shared symbols across oceans, in coastal ruins that seem built for fleets no one remembers. The lost network did not vanish without a trace. It left behind a trail of impossible connections, daring us to question the neat timelines we've been taught. If the ancient world was once disconnected, then the story of civilization isn't about discovery, it's about rediscovery. The deeper scholars dig, the more the old story begins to crack. Patterns appear where coincidence should not exist. Similar tools emerge in places oceans apart. Certain plant traces show up in regions where they were never native. Cultural motifs mirror each other across vast distances, not as identical copies, but as distant cousins shaped by time and translation. These are not the marks of isolated worlds. They are the fingerprints of contact. The problem is not the evidence. The problem is the framework used to interpret it. When we assume ancient people were limited, every sign of advanced connection becomes an anomaly instead of a clue. Trade networks do more than move objects. They move ideas. Navigation methods spread. Construction techniques travel. Even social customs migrate. A knot learned in one harbor appears generations later on another coast. A way of sealing cargo against seawater turns up in distant ship remains. These shared solutions point to a once common maritime culture, now shattered into regional fragments. It wasn't a single empire ruling the seas, but a shared system of exchange powerful enough to bind continents into a living web. But systems like this are fragile in one way. They depend on continuity. Break the chain of teachers and apprentices, and the knowledge collapses. Unlike stone monuments, trade routes are invisible. They exist only in memory, timing, and practice. When storms shift, when coastlines change, when harbors drown, the invisible roads disappear overnight. The ocean does not preserve footprints. It erases them. Without records, the greatest highway humanity ever built could vanish, without leaving a signpost. As centuries passed, later societies began to build stories to explain the artifacts they inherited. Some claimed the goods were gifts from gods. Others said they were spoils from lands beyond the edge of the world. A few believed they were remnants of a golden age when humans were greater than they are now. In a way, that last idea might be closest to truth, not because ancient people were superhuman, but because they were part of systems we no longer remember how to maintain. Their greatness was not individual genius, but collective continuity. When continuity broke, greatness faded into legend. What makes this loss unsettling is how quiet it was. There was no single collapse that history recorded, no dramatic fall of a known empire. The trade network dissolved in fragments, each community adapting to its own shrinking world. The oceans did not close. People closed themselves off from them. Fear replaced familiarity. The open sea turned from highway to horizon, from pathway to edge. By the time later explorers ventured far again, they believed they were the first to do so. They were not pioneers. They were inheritors of forgotten paths. And here's the uncomfortable part. Our modern world may be repeating the same mistake in reverse. We assume our global connections are permanent, that trade routes, shipping lanes, and communication networks are stable. But the ancient network likely felt permanent too, until it wasn't. Climate shifts, environmental change, and social collapse can unravel systems faster than records can preserve them. If the ancient world could lose a network that once linked continents without leaving written proof, what will future historians think of our era if our systems fracture and our data vanishes? The lost trade network becomes more than a mystery of the past. It becomes a mirror. It asks whether civilization moves in a straight line forward or in cycles of connection and forgetting. It suggests that history isn't just a story of building knowledge, but also of losing it, quietly, gradually, until what was once normal becomes unbelievable. As the idea of a lost global network slowly takes shape, it forces a rethink of what civilization even means. We picture progress as cities rising, borders expanding, records growing thicker with each generation. But the ancient trade web challenges that picture. It suggests that civilization can be defined by movement rather than monuments, by routes rather than rulers. The most powerful system of its age may not have had a capital, an emperor, or even a name. Its strength came from cooperation between distant communities that trusted the sea to carry their survival across the world. This kind of system leaves behind a strange kind of archaeology. Instead of grand ruins, it leaves distributions. Instead of palaces, it leaves patterns. Instead of royal inscriptions, it leaves shared practices scattered across coasts. To find it, we don't dig for a city. We trace the invisible lines between sites that should not be connected. We follow the trail of materials that appear where they don't belong. We listen for echoes in language, art, and technique that hint at forgotten contact. There is also a psychological resistance to this idea. It is comforting to believe that the past was simpler than the present, that we stand at the peak of connectivity, looking back at a world that slowly learned to link itself together. But the evidence hints at something more complicated. Connectivity can rise, fall, and rise again. The ancient world may have been more globally linked than we assume, and then less linked for a long stretch of time, before modern networks formed. This is not a story of steady progress. It is a story of fragile systems that depend on stability to survive. If that's true, then the disappearance of the ancient trade network was not just a loss of routes. It was a loss of worldview. People who once saw the ocean as a shared space began to see it as a boundary. Foreign lands turned from familiar destinations into mythical places. Cultural exchange slowed. Technologies developed in isolation instead of through shared refinement. The world shrank, not because continents moved apart, but because minds did. This shrinkage left a shadow on later history. When long-distance contact resumed, It did so violently, through conquest and domination rather than mutual exchange. What was once a web of trade became a struggle for control of routes. The memory of cooperation was gone, replaced by competition for access. The ancient network did not just move goods, it moved balance. When it vanished, imbalance followed. And yet, the fragments of that older balance remain embedded in the foundations of later civilizations. Techniques that seem to appear suddenly may be inherited echoes. Routes that later empires discovered may trace the skeleton of paths walked thousands of years earlier. Even the idea of global trade itself may not be a modern invention, but a revival of something deeply ancient, resurfacing after a long forgetting. This perspective doesn't reduce the achievements of later explorers or empires. It reframes them. It suggests they were not creating connection from nothing, but reopening doors that had once been wide open and then quietly closed. The ancient network becomes a reminder that humanity's greatest achievements are not always new. Sometimes they are returns to possibilities we once lived inside and then forgot how to reach. When all these pieces are placed together, the lost trade network stops looking like speculation and starts looking like a shadow history running beneath the one we know. It explains why distant cultures sometimes share techniques they should never have learned from each other. It explains why materials appear in places with no natural source. It explains why certain coastlines seem to have been settled, abandoned, and then rediscovered as if the first chapter was erased. The network was not a single road, but a living system of many routes, constantly adapting to winds, currents, and human memory. Its disappearance was not a single catastrophe. It was a slow unraveling. Harbors silted up, seas rose, storm seasons shifted. Communities that once lived by long-distance exchange turned inward to survive. The web of routes thinned until it snapped in places, then vanished altogether. When the last navigators who carried the old knowledge died, the world became bigger overnight, not because continents moved apart, but because the paths between them closed in the human mind. What remains is silence where there should be stories. We don't find names of the traders who crossed oceans before recorded history. We don't find maps of the routes they sailed. We find only the aftermath, artifacts out of place, patterns without authors, connections without records. History, written by those who came later, filled the silence with the idea that such connections never existed. It was easier to believe in isolation than to explain a global system that left no paperwork behind. The most powerful lesson of the lost trade network is not about the past. It's about how fragile connection really is. Even the greatest systems can vanish if they depend on knowledge passed only from person to person. When memory breaks, entire worlds collapse quietly. The ancient network didn't fail because it was weak. It failed because it was human. If the world was once connected in ways we've forgotten, then every strange artifact, every misplaced material, every shared symbol across oceans becomes a clue to a deeper story waiting to be pieced together. The past is not as silent as it seems. We just haven't learned how to listen to what the silence is trying to tell us. If this changed the way you see ancient history, follow Mystery of the Ancients. The next lost chapter of humanity's past might be hiding right under your feet or beneath the waves.